You ever have one of those moments where life is humming along just fine, peaceful, predictable, even pleasant, and then someone comes along and turns your world sideways like they mistook your front porch for a revolving door? Yeah, that was us. My name's Harold Whitman, retired history teacher, Vietnam vet, husband to the most remarkable woman I've ever known, and father to a baby boy who smiles like he's got the whole world figured out. We had just settled into a modest, tree-lined neighborhood in Oak Ridge Pines, one of those up-and-coming communities where folks still wave from their driveways, and you can hear kids laughing at dusk. We weren't exactly strangers to hard work. I spent decades teaching American history, Reconstruction, civil rights, the gritty chapters too many folks try to skip. My wife, Naomi, she's a pediatric nurse. Smart as a whip, kind to her bones, the sort of woman who could talk down a room full of screaming toddlers with nothing but a smile and a lollipop. And our son, Miles, just 6 months old at the time, chubby-cheeked, full of wonder, and the best part of my day. We moved into that house with big dreams and modest expectations. We weren't asking for much, just a little piece, a patch of green grass, and a place to raise our boy right. But it didn't take long before we learned that not everyone was thrilled about our arrival. 2 doors down lived a woman named Marlene Gratch. Now, I don't like to speak ill of neighbors, but Marlene was the kind of person who thought she was born with a gavel in one hand and a deed to the block in the other. Platinum blonde hair sprayed so stiff it looked like battle armor, pearls at the neck every afternoon, and a voice that could strip paint off a picket fence. At first it was little things. Comments about our mailbox, our lawn decor, the shade of blue Naomi chose for the front door. Just trying to keep the neighborhood looking respectable, she'd chirp, her lips stretched into a smile that never quite reached her eyes. I nodded, smiled back, didn't make waves. But there was something about the way she looked at us like we were tenants in a place we owned, guests at a party we weren't invited to. You don't forget that kind of feeling. Still, I let it slide. I'd seen worse in my time, and I figured if we just minded our business, she'd eventually find a new target for her passive-aggressive energy. That hope lasted right up until her son showed up. Derek Gratch, early 20s, entitled like he invented oxygen, and clearly raised to believe the world owed him something. He'd coast down the street on a longboard, music blaring from earbuds, tossing fast food wrappers on the sidewalk like they were rose petals, and he was royalty. At first I chalked it up to youth. We were all dumb once. But Derek wasn't just dumb, was dangerous in that casual, careless way that comes from never being told no. It was a Tuesday, I remember, because Naomi was home with Miles and I was at the local VFW, helping set up a veterans memorial panel. We were debating whether to include a quote from Lincoln or Douglas. Important stuff. Meanwhile, back at home, Naomi was bouncing Miles on her hip, half humming some lullaby, when the front door opened. Not knocked. Not rang. Opened. There stood Derek. Shirt half tucked, sunglasses on indoors, and a smirk so wide you'd think he owned the place. Naomi told me later that her heart dropped straight into her shoes. She clutched Miles tight and took a step back, but Derek just strolled in like he was checking into a motel. "Hey, you'll need to clear out," he said, like he was asking her to pass the salt. "I got a friend coming over, and we're going to use the pool. And probably the master bedroom, too. More private, you know." Naomi, bless her, didn't scream. She didn't panic. She stood tall, tucked our son behind her, and said as calmly as she could, "You need to leave. Right now? You're trespassing." Derek waved her off, all nonchalance and privilege. "My mom says you guys are barely home anyway. No big deal. No big deal." That phrase, that mindset, like our home was some abandoned warehouse and we were squatters instead of a family. Naomi picked up the phone, hit speed dial, and held it up so he could hear. "Harold," she said into the receiver, "there's a man in our house. Derek Gratch. He's demanding I leave with the baby." I was in the car before she finished the sentence. Didn't even say goodbye to the other vets. My hands were gripping the wheels so tight, I'm surprised it didn't crack. When I pulled into the driveway, Naomi was standing on the porch, pale but unshaken, Miles bundled close. Derek was gone, but something inside me had shifted. We called the police. 2 officers came by. One was young, looked like he was still figuring out how to fasten his badge. The other was a woman in her 50s, sharp-eyed and no-nonsense. Naomi told them everything, word for word. The young cop shrugged. "So he just walked in and then left?" I stepped in. He entered without permission, threatened my wife, and implied some kind of authority based on his mother's influence. That's not just poor manners, that's criminal. The older officer nodded, took notes, promised to speak with the Gratches. But the whole thing left a sour taste in my mouth. It was clear we'd get no real protection from the system. So I did what I've always done when faced with a bully. I started digging. Turns out, Marlene's ex-husband, Frank Gratch, Big Frank, they called him, was a retired steelworker with zero tolerance for nonsense. Lived across town, ran a modest machine shop, and had about as much patience for Derek's antics as I had for mold on my tomatoes. So I wrote Frank a letter. Not a rant, not a threat. Just the facts. What happened, when it happened, what Derek said, and what he intended to do. I mailed it registered, return receipt requested. 2 days later, Frank called. "Mr. Whitman," he said, voice like gravel. "I read your letter. We need to talk. Tomorrow, 8 a.m., at Rosie's Diner." The next morning, Naomi and I bundled Miles into the car and headed to Rosie's. Frank was already there, sipping black coffee, arms like tree trunks crossed over his chest. I shook his hand. Felt like gripping a wrench. We sat, and I laid it all out. Naomi added details. Frank didn't interrupt. When we finished, he leaned forward. "Let me be clear," he said. "I didn't raise him to be like that. His mother's spoiled him rotten. But he's my son, and this is unacceptable." A week later, Derek was gone from the street. Word spread fast. He was working at his dad's shop cleaning engine grease off parts with a toothbrush, waking up at 5 a.m., eating lunch standing up. His little sports car? Sold. His weekends? Over. Neighborhood gossip said Marlene tried to intervene, showed up at Frank's shop, only to be told, "He lives under my roof now, and my roof's got rules." Derek never came near our house again. When we'd pass him on the street, he'd look down, nod faintly, and shuffle off. Marlene? She started avoiding eye contact altogether. Her notes stopped. Her comments dried up. The woman who once tried to orchestrate the aesthetics of the entire block suddenly had a lot more time to focus on her begonias. In our house, it finally felt like a home again. Quiet. Safe. Ours. You know, folks think justice only comes in courtrooms or through fiery speeches. But sometimes, it walks in wearing oil-stained overalls and speaks with the quiet weight of a father who won't let his son become a disgrace. Sometimes, the real victories are the ones that don't make headlines but change the way you sleep at night. So if you've ever been told you don't belong in your own home, or felt like you had to defend your family's right to exist peacefully, let me tell you there's more than one way to fight back. And sometimes, the best weapon you've got is a calm voice, a written record, and the right ear to hear it. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had a neighbor like that? Someone who crossed a line so bold it still makes your blood boil? Share your story in the comments, and if you're lucky enough to have a big Frank in your corner, give that man a handshake from me. Because some lessons need to be taught the hard way. And some homes, they're worth defending with everything you've got.